but I think it's damn stupid.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay. You want to hear about Marilyn's background?
All right.
Her father was my youngest brother. My mother was the old school. She had nine sons and 2 daughters. She was a busy lady. And Herman there was a child between the 2 of us who died, the first girl to surface out. And she died at the age of 2.5, and I was born 6 months later. And that begins the story. And if I go backwards up, I'll start chronologically. You want all the uncles? First,
Yeah.
I'll tell you that Sam once said to me, Bubby, tell us a story. And I want to hear about your brothers. I know all about them. But you never can know all about them because it's a lot of telling.
Mm-hmm.
My mother's first 2 children, first 2 boys, died. So either stillbirths or soon after birth, I don't know. But the child mortality was very great in that period. Then the next 7 boys were a success, whammo, right down the line, and there was 2 years between each one. The fairy tale with the people of that era was if you nursed a baby, you'd never become impregnated. But my mother defied that rule, and this is the rule. The oldest brother was named, there's a custom, and this is a superstition, not religious law or anything, which is a superstition, that if you lose a child and you want the next child to live, you must do something about waylaying the angel of death, the devil. So if a child was born and he was a beautiful little child, you were supposed to go, pooh, pooh, you ugly thing. Then the angel of death say, I don't want that one. And you saved him. And they figured that worked. But that older child was never called an endearing term. The mothers would call him. Did you know this, what I'm telling you? Yeah.
No, vaguely.
So they named, whatever the child was named, his Hebrew name, they referred to him with the German word Alter, A-L-T-E-R, which means old one. And the female is Alte, A-L-T-E. So when people my age knew girls and boys who were called Alter and Alta, it simply meant that there had been trouble in the family and they weren't going to have any more chances with an angel of death. He wasn't getting any more of our kids. And they also had a superstition that if you tied a red string or a red ribbon around the wrist of the child, that would ward off the evil spirits. So from there on, my mother came to America. Was she living, she'd be 112 years old, and God may I not emanate her, or repeat her progress, with 3 little children. H.B., who's your Uncle Harry, and he was called Alta because he was the first one. They didn't get him because he lived to 79, so that's a fallacy, isn't it? And she had a boy of 5, a boy of 3, and a boy of 1. The 1-year-old boy just died last year, Eli, at the age of 97. This background isn't important, but it dispels all superstition. And a sense of humor was never lacking when my mother was around. And when I was a small girl, I asked her, Mom, how come, Ma, since I was in Boston, Ma, how come that there's so much space between this one and this one? And she says, well, there was no airmail in those days. My father was in America. She was in Russia. And she finally came over with these 3 kids, and they landed in New York City. And my father was up in Gloversville, New York, which is a big distance from...
What year did she come?
Huh?
What year did she come
Oh,
over?
now, I'm very bad on arithmetic. You'll just have to go by the fact that my 1-year-old brother, who died at the age of 97.
okay.
So you do the arithmetic on the QT. I can't even balance a checkbook. She wants me to give her statistics. So this woman came with these kids, and my father never showed up in New York City to greet her at what was called Castle Garden, because there was a castle. It was now later called, I forgot what they call it now, but I'll think of it. Well, Ellis Island, but originally it was called Castle Garden. She arrived and no husband. But relatives of my mother's knew she was coming, and they went and got her with the 3 kids and stuck her right on a train to go up to Gloversville, New York, which was one long trip. They had never been on a train, the children. She had probably not either. And a man became interested in this woman with her kids. He was a German. And my mother spoke 7 languages, but she was illiterate. She could read and write nothing, but she spoke. I'm telling you this because don't ever think you have to hide your mother's side under a bushel, because they wouldn't stay there, they'd crawl right out. She talked to this man, and he said to my mother, oh, he gave Sam, the second child, that's the father of Leon and Razel and all that, their father, gave him a big, lovely red apple, and the kid had never seen an apple. Of course, they didn't come to the cold countries then, and they didn't grow them there. Today, you grow them in California. Tomorrow, you sell them in Oskaloosa, if not someplace else. And he held that apple, and he bit into it, and yeah, it was a tomato. And all the yuck came out of the tomato, and the kid threw it across the train. To the day he died, my brother Sam couldn't tolerate the sight of a tomato. Isn't that a psychologic something or other? Anyhow, the man gave the kids a banana, and one of the kids said in Yiddish to my mother, I'm not going to eat that. It looks like dirt, but he used the real good word for it, which in that language is 4-letter too. But they settled up in Gloversville, New York. They had never seen a black person in their lives, and the milk was delivered by a black man, and you hung a tin pail on the tree limb, and he poured in from his container to hers, whatever it was, a quart or a half a gallon. The kid would not drink the milk because a black devil had brought it. They were frightened. But then, when Michelle was in the mall recently, she saw a black person, and she hollered, "That's Michael Jackson!" So you can't really hold it against them, or we'll pass on. My father wasn't doing so well economically. They were very lonely. My mother didn't know the language. Just one more story about up there. Came Friday, and she had to prepare for the Sabbath, which required baking white bread, challah, and my father showed her how to run the coal stove, but he forgot to tell her about the damper in the flue. If you know what I'm talking about, you young people. Deanne looks. You shut off the air, see, to reduce the amount of heat, and all of a sudden the lids on the stove were fiery red, and she grabbed a bucket of water and threw it on. And the house was filled with steam, and she ran out screaming. She didn't know what she did, but it was going to be Shabbat, and she had to make the white bread. But as she went through things, she had flour, she had this, she had that. She didn't have any yeast, and what to do. So she went to the neighbor next door, who didn't speak any of my mother's 7 languages, just one. English of a sort, and they couldn't communicate, but my mother had to have yeast. Finally, she showed the woman what she wants, you know, and the woman said, oh, and she went to her cabinet, or pantry as they called it, and handed my mother a little square package in silver paper, and my mother shook her head. She knew that, yes and no, that was her extent of her English. And she opened it up and smelled it, and lo and behold, it was yeast. It was Fleischmann's yeast, the original packages.
Wow.
So she made bread. Anyhow, they came up to Boston where my mother had family and my father had family. My mother's family were very better educated. There was 19 years between my mother and her older sister. Why, I've never known. Was it the same husband or was it a second husband? And she married a scholar, a Hebrew scholar, and they had lived in a place called Courland, which is on the border. Is all this new to you, Marilyn?
Some of it.
Which is on the border. Oh, gee, it's better than the typewriter. My hand would be tired by now. My tongue would never be. It was on the border of Russia and Germany, so that the intellectual and educational opportunities were greater. And talk about prejudice. My mother always referred to her sister, and he was still a teacher when he came to America with a long beard. He taught Hebrew. He read his religious books day and night, and she had a very lovely family. To us, when we had a chance to go visit, it was going from the slums of Boston out to the suburbs, Dorchester, which today is murder incorporated. You don't dare go there. And my mother would say, we're going to see my sister, and with all the scorn and derision that she could summon, she'd say, mein Schwester, die Deutsche. In other words, my sister, the German one. So you see, the prejudice was there from way back. Anyhow, they had a very hard time in Boston. My father had no particular, he went to Gloversville because when he got out of the Russian army, he worked in a tannery, and Gloversville to this day, and it gets its name, the place where they made gloves. And they settled in Boston, and the kids started coming, every 2 years a kid. And in Boston in those days, it was a long way to your father, Marilyn, hang on, that's, you know, he's the last one. In those days, they didn't record births in City Hall like they do now, but in the springtime, someone came around and got a list of all the kids that were born. So they reported. The older boys were still, the three boys were already speaking English. They were out in the street. They didn't need special schools. But they were settled in the north end of Boston, which you should know because in the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, that's the area where Paul stood and watched the signal lights. One if by land, two if by sea, high on the opposite shore would be the Old North Church.
Yeah.
Well, my mother didn't know what to say the kid's name was, so she thought, and she said, tell him the baby's name is Joe. Because Joe is a good American name, I found out. Why is he Joe? And my mother would say, I hear the Telemachus, that means the Italian female. A man was a Telena and a woman was a Telemachus, you know, with the Russian. I hear the Telemachus open the window and holler, hey, Joe, come up, I'm breaking your neck. Hey, Joe, come up, I kill you. And then sometimes the Iceman came, and you put a card in the window, what size piece of ice you wanted to put in the ice box. And she said, the same Telemachus leaned out the window and she hollered, hey, Joe, bring up for 5 cents. So she decided that was a good name. Now, the child's name, had it been translated into proper English, would have been Solomon Joseph. But he went through life called Joseph, my brother Joe, and we have a whole string of Joes in our family. My son, and before him, there seem to be Joes all over. In my Goodman book, which you could show Deanne sometime, because your mother has next to the most full record, because like a fool I copied it for her, and it's difficult. I have put a footnote in my page on Joe, what his name was in Hebrew, and how it, you know, see the addendum or whatever. I never got around, but this is the addendum. That sort of took care of that period. Then they moved out to a little country called Ayer, Mass, where there were no Jews, just none. They lived there for 17 years, and they owned their own house, which was 1 Main Street. We all went out to see. You go to Gettysburg, we went out to see the house at 1 Main Street. And my father's business was On my birth certificate, the rotten things, it says born March 5th. I was born March 4th. Very intelligent. I guess my father didn't get around to tell until the next day that a baby was born. And it said son of, a daughter of Rosa Feinberg Goodman, that was my mother, and Louis Goodman, junk dealer. Well, he wasn't a junk dealer, but he was, in a way. He had what was called a tin cart, and you went out in the countryside, and you've heard of Groton, the prep school for Harvard? Well, in those days, only the very wealthy could go, and today only the very snobby and academically good can go. It was a stepping stone to Harvard, and these kids were just lousy with money. I guess they had a buck in their pocket away from school, away from home rather. And he used to barter with the kids. They'd say, what do you want? He wants our kids were the best dressed kids in the whole Goodman family in Boston. They had football sweaters, they had bags of tennis balls, they have footballs, they had skating hats, skating scarves. The kids, these rich kids, didn't have money. So they would say, well, for $1, what do you give me? Okay. So they would sell their possessions. And I put this in to show that kids are kids, and an allowance is an allowance, and there's someone. But he would go around to the women and the farmers, and they would wait for them and say, oh, Louis is coming today. And he would barter, what do you need? She said, well, I need a copper wash boiler. So he had a horse and wagon, and it was called a tin cart, T-I-N, cart. And he had all his wares up. An itinerant, Pennsylvania Dutch did that. And he would say, well, what do you got? He said, well, I have these. They belong to my great-grandmother, Susanna, or whoever. And he would take that, and that, and that. And he was especially anxious to get pots and pans of antiquity for a reason. He smashed them, pressed them down, baled them, and shipped them to Boston to a dealer who melted them. And all these precious antiques went out the window.
Oh,
I mean, they didn't know.
back then, yeah.
But anyhow, they lived there many years. I was born there. Herman was not. Herman was born in Boston on a street called Hale Street. They had made progress from an Italian ghetto to a Jewish ghetto. And my mother decided that this was no place to raise her children. They weren't getting any, they didn't know anything about their people. And they used to have a teacher come in once a week from Boston who was called a rebbe. The word rabbi really doesn't mean clergyman or minister, it means teacher. And when you had a guy come into the house to teach you, they called him a rebbe. In other words, an itinerant teacher. That's exactly what he was. And this is a funny one, and then I'll leave Ayer Junction and take you to Boston. Everything worked out of the kitchen sink. There, you know, there were pumps and so on. There was an iron stove in the kitchen. And this rebbe, and they used to call, his name was Trobe, T-R-A-U-B, and his full title was Reb Trobe. And he used to come down to Ayer. It was wonderful. He got out of the stink of the ghetto, and he was out here in the country where there were trees and fresh air. He adored it. And my mother came in one day, and she saw Reb Trobe standing at her iron kitchen sink, looking in the little mirror above, and he's brushing his beard, my God, with her toothbrush, which hung there at the sink. Everything was at the sink. And he said to my mother, a wonderful little brush to brush the beard. And my mother ran out into the yard and upchucked whatever she could. She was so repelled. That was the end of the Hebrew teaching in my house. Send him back to Boston, never get him back again. Then they came up, and I'll take a quick jump or I'll be here till next Wednesday. Herman and I, there were 5 years between us, and my mother adored him. I don't know why. Someone once asked my mother, which of your children do you like best? And she'd say, stupid woman. I have 10 fingers, whichever one I cut hurts. I like them all the same, like my 10 fingers, but not so. Mike was her favorite because we were all dark and swarthy, and by the way, I'll sit in the back seat when I get home on the streetcar. And her favorites were Mike, who looked just like her, and Herman, who was her youngest. And he had very curly hair. Understand nothing of this do I remember, but I heard them. I was my mother's companion. My father died when I was about 13. About 10 or 11. And I was with my mother constantly. That accounts for why I speak Yiddish as well as I do. And she told me all these stories, but she had names for Herman. She would rub her hand through his hair. It was like these damn curly doos that women have now, the curly heads, like Marilyn. Don't like her haircut. And she would call him, in Russian, my baranchikal, which meant my little lamb. That's a Russian word. Or she'd call him my Ketzler, my little kitten. Well, because he had this curly hair. That was the first time I was aware of him, hearing those stories. But when we got up to Boston, all the kids had to work. There just were hard, terrible times. And the stories of the early days are more are fuller than what I can tell you what the boys grew up. Can't tell you much about Herman because he was born in Boston, but they went right down to Ayer to live. And there, the peddlers from, I'm skipping a whole bunch of years, the peddlers, the Jewish peddlers, who were all out through Massachusetts and so on, knew that when it was 12 o'clock Friday, they had to stop their activity, hitch up the horses, and
Can we stop it?
Yeah, I think that.
oh, it's Jean, I don't want to tell him. Oh
Hey,
yeah,
we're
where are we?
recording now.
We're talking about
Right.
Herman. Of all the kids, nobody made college except my brother Mike. They all dropped out for various reasons, usually economics. But Herman was an entrepreneur. He was all of 13 years old when he had a job with a company called Boyle Brothers, who sold clothing on credit. And his job was to go out and locate the bum payers, the bad beats. And one day he found out that a certain customer was sailing on a merchant marine ship for Brazil. So he quick went down to the waterfront, you know, and found the ship and got on the ship to locate this guy to get the $2 payment that was due on the suit that he bought. When he suddenly realized the boat was moving, and he jumped from the boat onto the wharf, or else you might all be Brazilians.
Oh boy.
And he was a nice little guy. He got himself, we didn't live in the Back Bay where the aristocracy lived. My mother and father had a little grocery store in an interesting neighborhood which doesn't tell about our story but tells about American life. It was at one time the aristocracy lived there. Not the Kennedys, if you please, they came long after, but the real old New England backbone Mayflower. And then the neighborhood changed. They moved further out, and the cheap Irish, as they were called, moved in. Still no blacks. And one or two Jews moved into this area, which that's where much of the time the boys growing up was there. And I'll try to keep to Herman. He was really always out looking for a buck because you have to have it. And so he had 1 year of high school and said, this is not for me. And then he got this wonderful job chasing bad beats and almost going to Brazil. There was a bunch of boys that always hung around, and I'll go on record and tell you, on Sunday they shot crap in the alley in back. My mother's little store was closed on Sunday, and the cops were all Irish in Boston. And our cop was O'Neill, and he had a brogue, baby, he had a brogue. So he came into my mother one day and he said to her, Mrs. Goodman, he doesn't have to respect me, he has to respect the buttons. Meaning on the uniform. And the uniform, as you may have seen in the Keystone Cop comedies, with the big hat like a London bobby, you know, with his badge in front and buttons all the way down to below his knees because it was a long jacket. So you had to respect the buttons if nothing else. But one day they got carried away with a crap game and they were all pinched, including Marilyn's father. And they were given a ride in the paddy wagon, which is what they still call a police van is called a paddy wagon. And O'Neill came to tell my mother that goodbye was arrested. He was shooting crap on Sunday. Now that was worse than shooting crap on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. And my mother, my father as usual was not home. It was an emergency. He was out with his fraternity brothers, the lodges. He was a great joiner, but he never joined in helping carry the burden of the family. So my mother took her darling little pussycat by the hand, and they went to court, as it was called, children's court, juvenile court, but mother called it children's court. And the judge was a Judge Baker, who was very fond and did a great deal for children in the ghetto, in the slums. And he said to my mother, it's $5 to bail him out, and he has to come to court tomorrow. And my mother said, but Judge Baker, I don't have $5. He said, well, what are you going to do? And she had the imagination to bring her bank book from the Boston Penny Savings Bank. And she said to the judge, if you let out my boy, I could just picture her, if you let out my boy, I'll go tomorrow morning and I'll take out $5 from the bank and I'll bring it to you for the bail. So this I can remember already. So she said, she grabbed him by the ear and dragged him home, and did he get what for? But now talk of a bank book, I never saw it, but I'm sure if she had $8 there, it was one big fortune. And this stinker cost $5 to get him out of the clink, you know. Gee, your father must be doing the Highland Fling listening to this. So he got lectured. My mother threw the book at him. And we lived in an unusual house, which at one time was one of these aristocratic townhouses. The help in the basement, and then there was a parlor on the first floor and bedrooms above. But by the time my parents got there, we all slept upstairs. And my father had cut out a hole from over the kitchen stove and made a door on hinges. So with a broomstick, you pushed up the cover, and you got a little bit of the heat. And oh, don't let me forget about heat. That's a good one. And and we would open the door and listen to our parents talk downstairs. Oh boy, that was terrible. But they fooled us. They didn't talk English and they didn't talk Yiddish. They talked Polish and Russian, and when they talked those languages, we knew someone's behind was going to burn. Someone did something wrong. But anyhow, there was Herman standing, and my mother lecturing him, and I didn't, you know, you don't do that, you don't defy the law, and I won't have gambling in my house. And Herman was standing there. If you've ever seen an old kitchen stove, there were places on the top where you put the pots, and in the front was a place where the ashes sifted down through the grate, and he had his foot up on the grate, and he was weeping. He didn't know what my mother was going to skin him alive. So he was listening to all her lecture, and he put his hand in his pocket, and he took out the pair of dice, and in those days, dice were made of either ivory, a bone, you know, they call them the bones, I suppose, and he lifted the lid and threw the dice in, and a beautiful fire came out, green and blue, and I was up in the hole watching it. Anyhow, whether he gambled again, I'm not sure, but not in my mother's house. But at about that same time, what was it about heat? Oh yes, in that house, it was so cold upstairs you could die. Of course, my mother decided one girl, she's got to take piano lessons. I hated the piano, and I hated my mother. I didn't want. My mother went and she bought a piano for $325. And it was on time, and this is 1985, and I don't think it's paid for yet. We went all through the business of my taking piano lessons, but off the parlor, as we called it, nobody used it. It was upstairs. It had all fancy pansies, things that my mother had salvaged from her husband's bargaining days, you know, beautiful antiques. Like, well, I'll finish with the heat, and then I'll tell you the room. And there was a little, the grocery store was on the street floor, and above it was a bedroom, which was mine and Herman's. We shared a bed, which filled up the whole room. But, due respect to him, that stinker, I had to go to bed first because I was the youngest. And then he was sent up to bed. By that time, I was asleep. And he would come up, pick me up and shove me over to the other side of the bed. It was cold, and he had a nice warm place that I had warmed up. She wants stories about her father, but there aren't too many to tell.
How about swinging over to HB and the others?
Well, yeah, he played me dirt one time, and I think he stopped being my favorite brother for a number of years. I don't know if I can stress this. I was a terrible talker in school. I'm better now. And evidently I had done something very wrong. This was 3rd grade. I don't know what my sin was, but the teacher gave me a note to take home to my mother, and I was afraid to take it home. I walked around the block a couple of times, and I tore the note up and I threw it into the sewer. By that time, my mother, some rat, what did you call him, a stool pigeon or a rat or a nasty kid, had run home to my mother and said, Edna was bad, she got a note from the teacher. So my mother, when I walked in the house, my mother said, where's the letter from the teacher? What letter? Don't lie, you sin, don't add lie. Where is the note? I tore it up. So she said to Herman, quick, run to the school before the teacher goes away and find out what she did. Quick! And he went. Who was it? In Russia. He went over to the Nazis. He really did. He abandoned me. And I hated him for a long time for that. But we became friends. His days, he married very young. I don't know how old. You get the statistics from Marilyn. And how did we know that he was going with a girl? He never told my mother. By that time, we had moved from Springfield, Mass., where we had been, to Boston. That was World War I. And what the hell? I forgot the note what I was talking about. Herman. Yeah. Oh, it couldn't be too important because I don't remember what it was. But he always was out there to help my mother. He knew, and anyhow, if he earned $1.50 selling papers in 2 days, she got the whole $1.50, and she doled it out, you know. She had to. It was necessity, and I think it was the thing they did in those days. We knew that something was cooking in Glockamora, because my mother said, I don't understand. All of a sudden he comes home, he shaves, he combs his hair, he puts on a clean shirt, and I didn't tell him, puts on a tie, and he's gone. So the other boy said, and my father, of course, was gone, had died long before. The other boy said, Ma, for God's sakes, he's got a girl somewhere. And my mother says, oh, not my Herman kid now. He would tell me, oh yeah. But anyhow, this girl was the girl he married, who was Marilyn's mother. And she wasn't much older than he. They were very young marriage. But I think that kind of ties him up, except that he once bought me a birthday present that I have the evidence of. He went to the 5 and 10 and bought me a yard of pale blue ribbon, which definitely wasn't my color then. And it was my mother thought it was such a waste of money. It was probably 10 cents for a yard. So she folded that ribbon up to pocket size and I wore it in my best dress in a pocket, never got on my hair because that would have been a waste. But you know, it was a birthday present, and we kept up the birthday present for years. I was March 4th and he was March 10th. And long after I was living in New York on my own, he wrote me a letter and he says, let's play birthday cancellation. Don't you send me anything and I won't send you anything, and we didn't.
Another talk about the ironing.
The what?
Your ironing chore.
Oh, yes. Well, that was,
And
see, you got me skipping all about the chronology. The boys, a house full of boys, there were so many damn shirts, you know. In those days, anyone who could afford it took them to what they called the Chinks, which was bad. You know, you took the laundry to the Chinks. But they just threw them, you know, in the hamper. My mother was lucky she didn't have to pick them up off the floor. And I was already a freshman in high school, and we were living in Medford at that time, Medford, Mass. Also, Paul Revere, Medford Town, you remember? And when I came home from school, my mother would say, she started me ironing handkerchiefs. That on Tuesdays, you washed on Monday, you ironed on Tuesday. There was no variation. She was very New England Yankee by association, by osmosis. Everybody ironed on Tuesday. She was going to iron on Tuesday. And finally, she started to show me how you handle a shirt. You know, you iron the yoke first. And I rebelled, and I said, I'm not going to talk about women's rights. I'm not going to iron those shirts anymore. They don't pay me. And, you know, by the time I got through, the playtime was over. There'd be 10, 15 shirts piled up, you know, and my mother wanted the sleeves turned in, you know, all correct. And I just wasn't going to do it. So she came home, the boys came home, where are the clean shirts? Where are the shirts? And my mother said, your sister's on strike. She's not going to iron any more shirts. She wants to be paid. Well, how much do we have to pay her? My mother said, I think a nickel a shirt wouldn't be too much. So that was my first earning, a nickel a shirt. I was very glad to do 10 shirts at a nickel a shirt. But after that, I have no clear memory of, although we were near an age. There were painful parts of our association, very painful, which Marin can tell you if she wants. And what did you say you wanted me to talk about? HB. My oldest brother, HB, he was just a marvelous person. He was the one who was called Alter. He had 4 girls, and you met the 2 girls who came to my party. Girls, Deanne, this is for your benefit, girls from my viewpoint. One was 69 and the other one was waiting to become 70. But you see, the distance between my brother's children and me was small because my oldest brother, the top 3 brothers, the original immigrants who came over, were already married and had children all my age. My oldest niece is 4 years younger than I. That's Jeanette Smalley. And Ruth Goodman, Leon's sister, who died in Washington, was 4.5 years younger than me,
And you were the aunt.
Yes, because we grew up as not as aunt and niece. We grew up as sisters. In fact, when my mother died, in those days you didn't take a funeral into the synagogue at all, because that was a desecration. That wasn't for just anybody. A very great person, a great somebody or other, was given the honors of the casket being brought in. And my brother HB at that time was very involved in religion. I don't think basically he was a religious man, but he was a very well-educated, self-educated man. And anything we learned about books or poetry or anything before we went to school, his children and I got it from him, word of mouth. He knew about crossword puzzles. He was doing them. He was he left, my father took him in hand, this was back in Air, to teach him Yiddish. And he got it immediately. And he wrote my father a letter in Yiddish saying, "Dear Father, I don't want to learn Yiddish anymore because I can read it better than you can." And he got you know what for. And no fooling. I mean, there was no fooling about it. But he was a lovely, lovely man. He had these 4 daughters. And as I say, at my mother's funeral, which was March 27th, I don't know, in May, that's it, May something,
26.
26, yeah, she died. Because my brother was president of the congregation, you know, like an elder, they brought my mother into the sanctuary, and they had a service there. And I was sitting with the children, and everybody, and they go through a horrible ceremony, the Orthodox things. It comes from the biblical Lamentations. I will rent my garments and put ashes on my head, you know, when they were driven out of Jerusalem, see. And some of them still do it. They get the family together and they rend the garments. The officiating clergyman or the undertaker cuts the garment to commemorate that thing. I will rend my garments and put ashes on my head in mourning. And they did it to me. And all the people in the synagogue went, Mr. Goodman has 5 girls? We thought he had 4. See? We didn't know he had 5 girls. And then some enlightened person said he hasn't got 5 girls. The 5th girl is his sister. Sounds like incest, doesn't it? That just occurred to me. But anyhow, it gives you sort of a picture. But he was a wonderful person. He was kind. He was, as I say, self-educated, a gentleman, really and truly a gentleman, and he was loved by everybody. And his wife was a nice woman, but she couldn't hold a candle to him. But was she smart? I tell this to her daughters every time I have a chance. She never stepped ahead of him. She was not the dutiful Japanese wife walking in the back, but when he talked, she knew that he was way ahead of her. It was a wonderful marriage. She knew, the girls say, well, they always call her Mama. Mama knew that she wasn't educated and Daddy was, and she listened to him. Now that's an interesting thing about him. And he was kind to everybody. He was kind to everybody. That piano, which isn't paid for yet, went from my house to his. From his house, he decided that Marilyn maybe should take piano lessons. So he called Esther, your grandmother, and asked if they wanted the piano. And so the piano went from H.P.'s house to Herman's house. And then from Herman's house, you see what a musician Marilyn is, boy. She read about Bach in the paper the other day, so I guess she's a musician. And me, of course. And from there, that damn piano went out on the farm to my brother Eli's house. He was a farmer, and he had a son who could really sing Alexander's Ragtime Band. You know, he was one of those. And my mother was gone. We thought, boy, push over Paderewski. Here comes Herman Goodman. His name was also Herman. And that was a nice growing up, but with pain and with sadness. The next one.
How was Simon?
Yes,
he's way down. Simon is, yeah. You could pick out the age of anyone in the family. Take Simon. If Herman was 16, then Simon was 18, and the next one had to be 14. That's the girl that died, and then was Edna. You know, every 2 years she had a baby. And Simon was, he was a story all by himself. He never got along with the children, with the brothers. He always wanted things his way when he wanted him, and that prevailed until the day he died. And he died like a gentleman. He put his hat and coat on either to go out of his apartment or was coming back, and they found him the next day dead by his closet with his hat in his hand. I call that a beautiful death. When I think of Herman and Eli, who wants living till 97? But we have no choice. But I think, in later years, as I began to know, you know, become more sophisticated, I decided that he had migraine headaches. And when he had migraine headaches, and my Joe has them, when Joe gets a migraine headache, his wife, his children, his business, out of my way, and he's got to get into bed and sleep it off. I hope his children, it's a terrible curse, a migraine headache. And I think this kid suffered for him because he just was horrible. And the other boys teased him terribly, the other brothers. You know what a sad iron is? It's a little flat iron like a triangle. That's what we used. So someone had given Simon a little glad iron, toy one, and he loved it. This was back in Air Junction. He had a piece of cloth and he was ironing it. Well, that's all the brothers need, and they started, chinky, chinky, Chinaman, you know, and that killed him, and he cried and he screamed. And he was such a bad baby. This was a bad child. This was in the air, when they lived in Air, Mass. My mother would have him in a cradle, and as she stood over the wash tubs, scrubbing the clothes, she, with her foot reached back on the rocker of the cradle, she was rocking him, washing the clothes and rocking him to pacify him. And I still think it was, but however, it became a way of life with him to be different and difficult. He was very good about, he was successful. Whatever he did was right, turned money without an education. And he had a thing about educated people who couldn't make a living. This is very interesting. He was in the advertising business long after, when my mother died, we had to find him. He was somewhere in New England selling stamps to Italian women. You know, it was savings, see. He'd give him a book, and today she had a quarter, so she pasted the quarter in the book. The book was, it was something like S&H trading stamps, but he sold them the stamps. And then a salesman followed him, and he'd see Mrs. Macaroni or whatever had 3 books of stamps that she could get a chair or this or that. So he was doing it. We couldn't find him, and I didn't know the name of the company he worked on. And just like the telephone operators today, they got it through. I called the telephone operator and I said, "Can you help me? My mother just died. We're trying to locate my brother. I know nothing about him. I don't know the company he works, but he's a door-to-door salesman. And his territory, today, he's somewhere around Hartford, Connecticut, according to the way I figure it." So she took my number. She said, "I'll call you back." And about a half an hour later, my brother was on the line. The operator got on every little town. And this seems incredulous, doesn't it, about today? Call 1-800 for information, you know. But he was very independent. He respected people who had an education, but he didn't respect anyone with an education who couldn't provide for himself and his family and make a living. And his overall comment was, and he went to college yet, you know. So he was difficult, there's no question, but he never turned anyone down who needed money, never. Joe used to say about his uncle, he said, "Boy, every stumble bum on Broadway knew that he was a soft touch." And he was, you know, no nickel for a cup of coffee. Here, go get a pair of shoes, here's $1. He was very soft, but tough, really, really tough. You know, for 5 years, he and I did not talk to each other. Did you know that?
No.
We had a fight. My husband was already gone, dead. I'm getting to be like everybody, afraid to say the word dead. My husband was dead, and it was H.B. and Fanny's 50th wedding anniversary, and the children had invited us up to New London for the festivities, and he got on the line. I called him, and we were talking. He always called me to see how I was, and very aware of the fact that I was raising a child alone, or he would have loved to be responsible for Joe's upbringing. And he offered to pay Joe's college. And my brother-in-law, that's Uncle Abe said, "Why don't you let your brother help you pay for the boy's education?" I said, "He won't have it, and I won't have it." So he said, "Well, talk to Joe about it." And Joe says, "Mom, he was then a freshman at Penn. He said, on what you earn, I had gone back into offices and worked for lawyers at the time, and he said, from what you earn and what I can earn playing in a band Saturday night, can you put me through college? And I said, we can manage, but you'll have to have a better job than $15 a Saturday night. So he got all kinds of jobs, selling always connected with music. And Joe said, I will, if you can do it, I'm not going to college. I'm going out and get a full-time job. I will not sell my soul to my uncle. I'll have to, like a little boy, bring him my report card and show him that I'm doing well. But we had a terrible to-do. I screamed and yelled, I said, I'll see you up in Boston, in New London. He says, I'm not going. I said, why? He says, that's my business, I'm not going to tell you. So I jumped on him and I said, if HB died, that's Harry, if Harry dies, you certainly will come to his funeral, won't you? And I began to cry and hung up. Months went by and I didn't hear from him. Months. They spread into years. One day he called me. By that time I was already living where I am now, so it was 17 years ago, and Simon's dead 8. He said, I was just sitting here in my kitchen, Mrs. Boone, and thinking about you. I don't know what the hell we argued about. And I says, well, if you don't know what it was about, it couldn't have been very important. And I knew that it was an awful hard call for him to make. I said, would you like to jump on a train and come to Philadelphia? Or I'll jump on a train and I'll go down to New York. He says, come on into New York. I grabbed my hat and coat and a pair of pants, and I went to New York, and we talked and talked and talked. 5 years had passed. Now, I remember saying to Joe, if I die soon, before my brother Simon, don't you dare ever say to him, where were you those 5 years when you didn't talk to my mother? Remember that that man spilled his guts, that he suffered just as much as I did by being separated, but neither of us would give in. And you know that was something. And then he really was difficult. He came to visit Joe in his own business, and Joe was not there. And when Joe came in, the bookkeeper said to him, Joe, there's a man outside walking up and down. He asked for you. And I said you'd be in within a half hour. And I asked him to come in. And Joe says, that has to be my Uncle Simon. And he goes outside, and there's Simon pacing up and down on the sidewalk in front of, and Joe's office, business was in a warehouse, you know, music distribution, the office and everything in a warehouse. He wanted to see Joe. We came out, and I was there in Teaneck, in Tucson that time. No, in Teaneck, yeah, Teaneck is where he lives. I always confuse Tucson and Teaneck. He came home, and he met Nancy, and Elizabeth decided to entertain her uncle. She was a little snip. And she sat down at the piano playing, you know, bang, 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 bang. And little girls and boys would, he says, is it a girl or a boy? That's how little he knew about what was going on. Stayed about 20 minutes. He said, well, I gotta go. He always had to go. Took a hat and he had to go. It was just difficult to handle him at your mother's wedding. He came down, went to the synagogue, did his share of crying for the extenuating circumstances. Not that we got Maury with a shotgun to marry Marilyn. I'm referring to her unhappy childhood, which is your business, not mine. It was my business. And it's in the middle of celebration. He gets up and he says, I gotta go. Gets his hat and coat and takes a taxi down to the North Philadelphia. It goes. That's Simon. There's not much more I can tell you.
He never married.
Never married, no, never. And he was a ladies' man. He liked the ladies. Now, for instance, if he saw Deanne, he'd take a look at her and put his arm around her and, where you been all my life, honey? You know, that kind of crap, you know? And he says, boy, how come I didn't see you coming down the street? And he liked them young. And
Tell about Simon and his infatuation with the piano in the apartment.
he what?
Simon and the piano in his apartment.
Oh, yes. Well, that really was important. He had a piano in his apartment. At that time, he was advertising manager for the Musicians Union paper. I've forgotten the name of it. Anybody in the business knows. And guys used to come up to his place, you know, for ads and so on. And he figured any guy who comes in and he wants to play the piano, there's a piano. He had it. He couldn't play it. And he tried to pan it off on me. I didn't want it. I really didn't want it. But he was a strange man from the stories my mother used to tell about him, from the little iron, chinky.
What about
But,
Eli? Eli.
The next one was Eli. Eli was, he was the one who was a year old when my mother came over, and the one who just died last August at the age of 97. He had his son Herman, whom I, to the day he died, called him Yank. His name was Yankel, which is a Jacob, and I think that's a Russian translation of Yankel. But I always called him Yank, always, as I always call his daughter Shani instead of Jeanette. I think of him that way. Eli was difficult. He was a sick man. When he married this beautiful young girl, and she was beautiful, very recently come from Russia, and he met her through the man he worked for, who was a painter and paper hanger, and they came to live with us. What else would you do? You got married, you didn't have a dime or a nickel, you went to live with your mother. What the hell, one more mouth to feed. And she used to, the boys was just so excited. Here is not this snot Edna, you know, she's nothing, she's a kid. I was a little girl about 4. They had no time for me. But here was this beautiful girl, and they would tease her and, you know, wrestle with her, you know, and the boys would gang up on her, and the laughing and the gigglings, you know. And once they pinned her down on the ground, they were wrestling with her, and I guess 3 of the boys, and she was screaming to my mother, Schwieger, which is a German word for mother-in-law. Schwiegermutter in German means mother-in-law, you know, and Jews always speak of the mother-in-law as Schwieger, and usually with a negative connotation, not a good one. He called her, oh, she's a regular Schwieger, you know, she was a bitch. Take that one off. But my brother Mike, it was Mike, Simon, and Herman who had her pinned down. The other boys were all away. And they said, do you give up? Do you give up? And she says, not guilty. Not guilty. She knew she had to say, I surrender, see? Well, that has gone down in the family as a story. She's dead, Eli's dead, everybody's dead except me. And I think I'm dead crazy to sit here and talk like an idiot. What else do you want to know? We're up to
Did we
Eli.
cover all the brothers?
Huh?
Who did we miss?
What time do you have to be there?
Lovely place, and I would like to take a look at all the bank books here, because nobody is on relief or welfare and nobody's going hungry. It's a beautiful place, but nice place to spend your winters. But as a smart cookie said to me, I don't live on the grounds, I live inside, and they cost too much. And
Pyrocantha.
Pyrocantha. Yeah. You know, Is it on? Are we on? Oh, you know, I have a fear of that red light. It might mean something else. You're not old enough to know what a red light is. But anyhow, this is a nice place, and I'll be comfortable. And I'll be glad to go back to Wistful Vista, where the average age is 81.
And maybe she'll come back next year.
I don't think so, not next year. I have to balance the budget first. next brother in chronological order is Sam. He was the one of the 3 kids that came over with my mother originally. Sam was interesting to look at because he was a blonde. All his children were blonde. The rest of us were doubtful, black, various shades of black. And I always thought it was funny when his children started to grow up. By golly, John is a blonde, Leon is a blonde, and their children are blonde. So that goes back to my mother, who was fair, and my father, who was not unfair, but dark. And Eli was dark, short, swarthy man, and he always was troublesome. He never forgot to remind me that when we lived in Air Junction, and my mother had to be rushed to Boston for a gallstone operation, that he was only 17 years old, and he did the cooking for the whole crew. And one time, quote, I made a potato kugel and I forgot to put the salt in, and the kids didn't want it. Damn it, they ate that kugel because I thought it was a pretty damn good kugel, and I took care of you too, so he never let me forget that I was in his debt. He didn't have a very good life. He didn't have a good education. He had a great imagination. I don't know if I told you about was I on the record about Fanny saying I'd give up, surrender?
No.
No?
Yes.
Yes, I did? Okay. He had a lot of domestic problems, sickness. My sister-in-law was always with what her elders used to call woman's troubles. She was either had a miscarriage or she had something else, and her 3 oldest boys were always dumped on my mother. We lived 200 miles from Boston, which was Springfield, Mass, and we'd get a call, SOS, Ma, Fanny's in the hospital. All right, I'll come. And she would get out her $2.50 for the car fare, go to Boston, and bring back the 3 boys. So they got all their preschool education at my house with my mother. And the oldest boy was also called Herman. We had a spate of Hermans, I think I told you. And he stayed with my mother because he wasn't even school age at that time. And when my sister-in-law was all right, my mother would pack up the 3 kids and take them back to Boston. And then Eli became sick. I never knew what was the matter with him. He thought he just was dying of tuberculosis. He was just always a complainer. And my mother used to say in later, I said to my sister-in-law in later years, now cut that out. We'll go back. You're going to cut it out?
No, we can just keep going.
Yeah. Living already, my mother had him, we moved up to Medford, Massachusetts because it was World War I, and my brother Mike enlisted, and Herman enlisted, and Simon enlisted in the Navy and had to come back and say he was rejected, and he was just so bitter, you know, he wasn't even good enough for the Navy, that kind of thing. And so it was suggested that we move back to Boston, Medford, Mass, where we could be near the other married children. And Eli was always the one who had to be helped. Even when I was working in New York and doing quite nicely on my own, I'd get an SOS and say, we have to help Eli. And so we'd pass the hat among us. It wasn't that he was he just was the victim of a series of tough luck. And had a very negative personality, which doesn't help when you're in tough luck. His wife was an angel. She really was. I don't know how she put up with him. They had 4 kids. Yank, or Herman, was the oldest. And then they had a boy, Albert, who left home and became a regular Army. And we never saw him a great deal. I happened to be in Los Angeles while he was stationed in Houston, Texas somewhere. And on the trip back from Los Angeles, we were driving, my friend and I, on a trip. We went in to see him, and in comes this guy to see Goodman, and the soldiers all looked at me, and they took it for granted. Ha, she's a Mexican, you know. And they sent out on the field of the train, he was in the cavalry, and they said, someone's here to see you. One soldier told another, did you ever hear this, Marilyn?
No.
Until he came, this tall, slender guy, you know, burnt, but light-skinned. And of course I grabbed him and kissed him and hugged him. He was my brother's child. They weren't all good kids, but he's my brother's child. And it became a joke with all the guys. Hey, hey, he's got it made. But that boy went off to war. They shipped him out, and he, unfortunately, never came back. He was not killed in action, but he was in that famous death march of MacArthur's, I Shall Return. They never could locate him, and for almost 10 years, the government kept him on the list as an MIA. And one day, Marilyn, my brother Herman, that's Marilyn's father, got a call from somebody and said, "Is your name Goodman?" "Yes." "Would you know anyone by the name of Eli Goodman?" And he says, "Yes." "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, he had a son, and he has money in a bank somewhere in Texas, and we'll get it for you if you blah, blah, blah sign this." They were professional seekers of unclaimed funds. I guess he'd been in a good crap game one night, and he got a couple of $100, and he socked it away. So Herman, my brother Herman, immediately called, this is all new, my brother Herman immediately called L.I. and he says, "Keep your mouth shut. Anybody that asks you questions, don't send them to me." At that time, Herman was very patriotic and active in the American Legion, which I thought was a lot of applesauce, but he did it okay with me. So Herman got someone to investigate this, and the American Legion, or the Jewish war veterans, I think it was, he belonged to both. The Jewish war veterans got Herman the information that Albert Goodman had a bank account in this place in Texas. And Eli was able to sign the papers and get the money for him, for his family. And I don't remember the exact amount. I like to think it was something like $4,000 or $5,000. If it wasn't, these professional lookers wouldn't give a darn about him. And Herman got that money. Eli got that money. And of course it was a very sad time for his wife. I gave up my son, we got money for him, we bought my son for war, you know, all that kind of business, which was understandable. And for a long time, Eli did not touch that money. He thought it should go into a fund for someone who needed it. He needed it,
How about the
but he thought it was blood money, is the way he felt about it.
GI insurance?
No, this was GI insurance he got right along, but this extra bundle, I think, as we reconstructed it, the boys were shipped out from wherever they were to the Pacific, and I guess he got his, I really believe he picked up a couple of $100 in the crap game, but whatever it was, my brother Eli got it. But he also got the boys' GI insurance. We never heard from him again. And it was the beginning of the end of my sister-in-law. She had a phobia about it. She wouldn't accept that he was dead. She would, by this time, my brother had a chicken farm out in Hanson, Mass. And she would sit in front of the television and watch soldiers marching, and she'd holler, "Eli, Eli, here, come here, there's Mitch." His name was Albert Mitchell, and his Hebrew name was Avram Mitchell, so we called him Mitch. Here he is. By the time Eli got there, there was another, and she felt, "Oh my God, he's gone. How can I see him again?" You know, and she really, we believe that she lost her sanity at that time. There he is, and there he isn't. But back to Eli, he was tough. And I said to my sister-in-law one time, "How do you get along with him? He's so terrible, he's so stubborn." She says, I get along with him. She was deaf. And in those days they wore a big hearing aid on their bosoms, you know, not this little one. And I get along with him. I turn off the machine and I let him talk. Who listens? And that's how you get along with a difficult husband. He was in that chicken business, still not a well man, but working like a dog. One funny thing, which would be good, the chicken dealers would come in from the big cities and look over the flock and say, "Oh, we'll give you so many $100 for so many chickens." Bear in mind that Eli was short and swarthy, He looked just like a Portuguese or an Italian. He didn't look he didn't look Jewish or anything. He just was all by himself. And the guys came and they picked up all the chickens by the legs and they put them on the scale and weigh them, see? And Eli is standing there puffing on his pipe, which Marilyn remembers so well. He never parted from that pipe. And it stunk all the time. It was terrible. He was a smoker, day and night. And he hears the boss man of the chickens say to his helper, listen, this guinea doesn't know what he's doing. Put on a couple of extra, drop off a couple of extra pounds. So my brother, being cantankerous old son of a gun, said, I'll let them load the whole truck up. You know, they put them in wooden crates, packed them up. And when it's ready for the payoff, and the guy says X number of pounds, Eli says, take all the chickens off. Put them back in the hen house. I'm not selling to you because I'm not a stupid guinea. I'm a smart Jew. Get the hell out of here and don't you ever come to my farm again. Well, we thought that was very funny. We thought that was very funny. But he was capable of concocting such fantasies. We all knew it. My mother used to say, if Eli, we always called him Eli instead of Eli, if Eli said the fire engines came down Blue Hill Avenue with 7 horses dragging the fire engine, it was a false alarm with 2 horses. You know, that's how she categorized us. She knew when he was a young boy, very young boy, and I couldn't be more than, I was a little bit of a girl. This I didn't see, I remember. He came home and he told my mother, I'm going to join the Navy. Well, in those days, nice boys did not join the Navy. Nice boys from nice families didn't go in the Navy. So it was the trash that was picked up. And my father said, you're not going to join the Navy. And he said, I am. And my mother, little short mother that I was, she got him in a corner and she held out her hands to protect her darling from her husband. And he had a plate in his hand and he wanted to give it the kid over the head. He was a snot, about 17 years old. He was going to join the Navy. He was going to work, my mother thought. And I always remember it, my father trying to get him to hit him and Eli ducking behind my mother and she had her arms spread out. She was going to protect her child. It's not a nice story, but it fits Eli. But Eli's daughter and I became very friendly. Oh, and his oldest son got 1 year of college, Boston University, when Eli was taken very sick. I think he had a bad and complicated hernia condition, which he could not handle, lifting crates of hay and so on. And this boy, I loved him for this. He said, I will stop college and I will work on the farm for Pa. And he did. And it was very sad. Eli was in debt over his head. And this boy who gave up college went to the hay, feed, and grain people, and Eli owed about $300 or $400 for feed for the chickens, so they wouldn't give him any more credit. And the young man made a deal with the grain owner. All right, I will come to work for you, and I will drive the truck, and I will deliver the grain to the dealers, to the farmers, and whatever you pay me, you'll take off half each week towards my father's debt. Now that sounds like Horatio Alger's story, sink or swim, goodness against evil, but that's the kind of a guy he was. Also, back to his storytelling days, my niece used to say, we would sit at the table when I visited them. By this time, he'd given up his chicken farm, sold it for nothing, and a very popular people came along who ran one of these hotel, motel, gambling places, and they have a gorgeous place there. But how could he know? I used to say to Jeanette, whom I always called by her Jewish name, Shani, which is German for pretty one, and she's not. But we always called her that, Shani. And I used to say, gee, and my brother would be sitting there by the television day and night filling out his lottery cards. He was going to set the world straight. He'd win. And when she wanted to bring him something nice, she'd, here, Pa, bought you 2 lottery cards today, $4. He'd pay for them. You know, favor him. The mother had already died. And by the way, my first 3 sister-in-laws married to my first 3 brothers. Believe it or not, each one was named Fanny. I married Sam Boonen, and my dearest friend was his sister-in-law, Fanny. So we had 4 Fannies, but the 3 Goodman Fannies were fantastic. We knew, we used to call them Fanny number 1, number 2, number 3, in the order of their marriage. But later, my mother and I had a thing going between us. I was with her so much that I knew by what she was saying and the quality of what she was saying, which daughter-in-law wasn't towing the mark and which one she was talking about. That's just a little aside about Eli. His last years were very sad. He lived with his daughter. He owned a 2-family house in Brockton. He and his wife lived upstairs, and Jeanette and her husband lived downstairs. Jeanette has an adopted son, an only son, whose name is Albert, named for the boy who was killed in World War II. And my sister-in-law was very sick, and she died there. And so she took her father downstairs to live with her, and she really was a saint taking care of him because he was a tyrant. And one night we were playing cards, the 2 of us, and Eli is sitting there watching the television, listening to us. We thought he was deaf. And I said to Shani, I said, look, watch him. She says, keep your mouth shut. You know, he hears everything. So we started writing each other notes, see? And I wrote her a note about my brother, and she went this way. Don't believe it. When he went to bed, I said, you know what? I'm going to recommend your father to the Nobel Prize people for the great American literature writer he is. She says, great, great. So we were able to laugh about the problem. But finally, he got she's a nurse, a nurse's aide, and always has worked nights, and it got to the point where he no longer could take care of himself, and she would be up half the night tooting around, blowing his pipe, and never would use a match to light a pipe. He had to do it over the gas jet in the pantry. And she figured she'll come home one night and either find the house burnt down or him dead, and it came time she put him in a nursing home. But she was the most wonderful daughter. On her way to work, which began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and ended at 11:30 at night, she stopped at the nursing home. Her name is Benson, Mrs. Benson, and everybody calls her Benny at the hospital. And the nurses at the nursing home had got to the point, oh, let Goodman lay there. Benny will be here soon. She'll shave him, she'll wash him, she'll this. And I said to her, you don't have to do these things for your father. She said, are you going to do them? And I said, no. I said, you are paying for this nursing home. Most of it is coming from your father's funds, and the state takes care of it. Let them take care of him. She said, you don't understand at all, Edna. She said, I am not going to abandon my father like a rotten dog. He is my father. That broke me up terribly, and he didn't appreciate it. She'd say, hiya, Eli, how are you? Gee, your hair's all fussy, and she just smile at me. Come on, smile at me. And that's when I visited. I went to see him particularly, and my other brother Herman used to go out to see him too. He had the misfortune of having Yankel die and have to bury one son lost in the war, and Yankel was very, very sick. And we'll skip all that, but back to Eli. Just when he was 94, he said to his daughter, well, I only got 6 more years to go, so be patient. He was cantankerous. I can't think of nice words except cantankerous. Stubborn, tough to get along with.
Complete opposite of his HB.
What, huh?
Complete opposite.
Yes, the 2 brothers. Every one of us was different. My mother didn't repeat on one of us. Each one was different, each one. Except half of us were white and half of us were black. One day he started asking, he said, he referred to his wife as Ma, not my mother, but his wife, Ma. Where's Ma? She doesn't even come to see me. She doesn't care whether I live or die. And she said, Pa, you know that Ma, this is New England, Pa and Ma. She said, Pa, you know that Ma died a long time ago. He says, how long ago? She says, oh, 50 years. Well, it wasn't 50 years. Oh, and he's sucking on his pipe in bed, you know. And he said, well, what happened to somebody else? To her husband, Jeanette's husband died very early, probably at age 39. And she says, what happened to Russell? He died, Pa, I told you. Well, how about my mother? She died, Pa. I told you 50 years ago. And this wise old man at the point of death, he says, 50, 50. It seems to be a magic number. I thought that was rather sad. He was lucid enough to evaluate. This man, 20 years before he died, had arranged his funeral, paid the undertaker in the town where they lived. There were no Jewish undertakers or anything in that town. And this guy's name was Connolly, a good Irishman. He was very good friends with Eli all the years. I remember the amount. It was $1,500 that he paid Connolly and said where he wanted to be buried, and he wasn't going to have anybody bury him as a charity case. So he was an unusual man, but a toughie. His family now, all the boys are gone. Jeanette, they have a brother who might as well be gone. They don't pay any attention. Jeanette sums it up this way. I haven't heard from him since Herman died. If he couldn't pick up the telephone in San Francisco and say to me, hey, how's the old man? Is he still living? The hell with him. Let him be on his own. I'm not going to let him know when Pa dies. And she didn't, and she was right.
What about when he went to buy a car?
Huh?
When he went to buy the car?
He did.
Yeah, when...
Oh, yes, he decided that he was going to get into a car. He could hardly move. He was going to buy a car, and he was going to drive out to San Francisco. He had a grandson in San Francisco who divorced one of his boys, and he wanted to see his grandson's name, who had left the family as William Goodman. But his mother remarried after she divorced Carol, or Kivy as we called him. And her husband adopted this boy, and they never got to see their grandson again. They wanted to, but they weren't welcome. The daughter-in-law, ex-daughter-in-law, said, "Look, he's our boy, and forget it." But we now, in recent years, I learned that he's in one of the Eastern College and has a full professorship in something like chemistry, or, not typewriting, but something that really was worthwhile. And that about rounds them up. Yonk has a widow and one son. She gave up her home in Brockton, Mass, and moved out to Central City, which is way up near Spokane, Washington. It's in California, and she lives on her own. Am I on? She lives on her own in a mobile home and is very, very good friends with her daughter-in-law, and she's now a great-grandmother. Eli never saw his great-grandchildren, but he died at 97, 14 days after Herman died. Interesting? That takes care of Eli enough, but he was priceless with his stories. After Eli, did we do Mike?
No?
No.
Mike was wonderful. My mother had a thing about him. He was her seventh son. Counting the two that had died, he was the seventh one. And my mother believed in the superstition, mostly of the Irish with whom she lived all her life, that the seventh son had a healing facility. He healed the multitudes. Sort of the Jesus story all over again, I suppose. I don't know. They believed it. And my mother decided that her seventh son had special qualities. Well, he did, but it had nothing to do with that. First of all, he was the only one that got any kind of a formal education, any kind. And he went in to be a pharmacist. And he was very kind to my mother. She adored him. Oh, Herr Mikey, there was no one like him. And Joe, the one I missed Joe too, didn't I?
Yes.
Well, we'll come back to Joe. Mike was called the professor in the family because he was going to be a pharmacist. And, my mother and her provisor, professor, Russian provisor. And he was kind to her. He did things for her. He made it his business when the holidays came. She could not read Hebrew or anything. He went with her, and he saw that she was seated with the ladies in the little synagogue who were literate and could read. And when they wept about the expulsion from Jerusalem or whatever it was, she wept with them. You know, she knew that Mike sat her near these women so that she could enjoy the weeping, the sorrow of the holiday. But he was a great guy. He was a ladies' man. He was pretty nice looking. He became a registered pharmacist. But in those days, you didn't have to take board exams, go to college or take board exams. You just got yourself the United States Pharmacopoeia, and you read and you read and you read, like the lawyers who didn't go to law school but just read the law. And she was very proud of him. And the other boys just kidded her. Ma, you like Mike better than us. Come on, you like him the best. No, I don't. Well, which one do you like the best? And she say, which one do I like the best? I have 10 fingers. Whichever finger I cut hurts. You all hurt, and I love you all. And that's the way she settled it, but we knew differently. World War I broke out, and Mike enlisted in the medical corps and was sent off with the American Expeditionary Forces to Belgium. Before he went, he wrote me a letter. He says, "Do not read this letter to Ma. I am being shipped out of the country. I don't want her to worry about me being shot down in a submarine, you know, on the bottom of the ocean." He said, "I have given my girlfriend a bunch of letters, different dated, and this is the girl whom he married after the war. She was a New York girl, and she met him at a, what did they call them, the stage door canteen or something, you know, where you volunteered to entertain the forces. And he said, you'll read the letters to Ma, and it'll keep her in peace." When he landed in Europe, the Army, the YMCA gave each boy a card to fill out to send home, and it said, "Dear Mother, I have arrived safely in France. I am well, love, Michael." Well, the axe fell. I got the card before she got it when I came home from school, and I had been answering his letters. My mother would say, "Tell him this, ask him this," you know, and whatever my mother dictated, I answered. But I knew he was on the high seas, but I wasn't sophisticated enough to know to throw the letters in the garbage can. I didn't know what to do with them. So she'd give me a 2-cent stamp, pound it on. She didn't trust me to get it on tight. And I would go to the corner and tear the letter up in little bits and let it go down the sewer. Did you mail the letter? Did you put it in the box? Sure. So that when she got this card saying I am in France, oh boy, it was Yom Kippur at my house. That's a holiday of weeping. And did I get it? Oh, I was impossible. What did I mean by such a thing? You knew. What did you do with the letters? I said, I mailed them. The government must have held them back. I wasn't going to get beat, you know. It was a terrible thing for her. She spent her days, like her daughter-in-law, years later, waiting for her son to come back. But Mike did come back. And to backspace a little bit, he used to do, he was a terrible sleeper. We could never get him up. And he had a job, and he worked for Scotchmen. And the guys who was going to Scotland on a visit, this is how serious the boys were in those days, just like today. But so this guy loved his fedora hat. So Mike decided, let's hide his hat. Then McLaughlin won't be able to go to something, I don't remember, won't be able to go to Scotland to meet his family. Well, it was a whole deal every day. Did he come for the hat? Didn't he? Everybody was in the joke. But they didn't want to be in a joke themselves. And he had a girl, a woman that he knew, a girlfriend, I don't know what they called them in those days, down in Hartford, Connecticut, which was right near Springfield. And my mother disapproved of her most heartily because she was a divorcee and she was French. And to my mother, those two things did not spell respectability. So she used to get, this woman, this gal, this divorcee, used to write to Mike. stupid woman, write to the drugstore, don't write to his house. My mother wasn't above snitching the letters, and when I came home from school, read me what the French girl said already. And I loved Mike. He was my ideal. I thought that he was the best thing in the world, because he once told my mother if she ever married again, he'd take the kid and disappear with her. I was the kid. She didn't marry again, and he didn't disappear. But I thought he was great. I couldn't betray him, but now my mother wanted to know what was in those letters, and if I stopped, sort of to editorialize a little bit, she'd say, so what are you leaving out? What aren't you reading me? And I said, Ma, this is what he said. Well, we had all these letters from the French girl. Mike is in France. What shall we do with the letters? Came a great problem, and this will be the end of the Mike story for the time. We'll have to hide the letters. We had a great big wooden dining room table from the country days, where you sat down and ate the whole family. I bet you it would take up almost all of this room. Underneath was a ledge. I guess today kids stuck chewing gum on there. So I said to my mother, we'll put the letters under the ledge. No, my mother said it'll fall out, he'll see them. She says, I know. On the wall was a picture of my grandmother and my grandfather. And that was a thing. You had the ancestors on the wall. It was a very rococo frame. So she took down my grandfather's picture, which was backed up with thin wood like plywood. She loosened a couple of nails, and we stuck the letters in behind the grandpa's picture, the Zeta. Zeta means grandfather, and we banged them down, and we did our duty. We didn't throw them out. My mother, I don't know what ever happened to the pictures. We moved up to Boston. In the transition, they got lost. My grandmother and my grandfather. We weren't kosher Jews anymore. We didn't have the grandparents on the wall. We could have sold them as antiques and made a fortune. One day it occurred to me I was telling this story to my husband. Years later, everybody was dead, my mother, my brother. And I said, Sam, can you imagine some guy in an antique shop bought my grandfather's picture? And when he read those letters, he said, boy, was that old man a hot potato. And that was the end of that. Oh. Mike did come back from the war with a very badly infected face. He was right out on the front lines with the ambulance corps, and he picked up a face disease. It was terrible when he came back, and he was meeting the public, and he used to make a beard out of a bandage, like a whole beard, to cover up his face. He got rid of it eventually, but dermatology then wasn't what it is today. He married this girl who helped him fake the letters, and she lived to be 82, never married, went back to New York to live with her family. And the only thing I will always remember about her kindly is this. When my husband died, she was living in New York with her family, and she came to Philadelphia to spend a week with me after the hubbub of the funeral, and I was telling her all my problems, and she said, I have some advice for you. I'm not going to tell you what to do or how to do it, but take this advice that I give you freely and honestly. Whatever you do, Edna, be sure that your feet are under your own table, not under anyone else's. And that told me that she was having a hard time with her only child, a year older than Marilyn. She was living with her mother and father. There was a house full of unmarried kids, a daughter and her husband who wasn't making a living with his kids, and here she came with her little girl. She must have gone through a real squeezer emotionally. I never was particularly fond of her. We didn't have a lot in common. She was one of these after me, you come first girls, and I didn't think she was very nice to my mother, but what's the difference? It's all over. But I never forgot it. And I was very close with her daughter, who now lives somewhere up in Colorado. That takes care of Mike pretty well. Joe is the one I left out. Joe was, he was the family jester. And in Yiddish it's called a letz, L-E-T-Z, you know, a joker, a letz. And he could do the damnedest things to irritate and irk everybody, but he was a great guy. They were all the boys had a printing shop in Boston. H.B. and Joe were partners down there. Herman was learning to be a compositor under his brother H.B. See? Then they moved up to Boston and expanded, and my brother Sam, who was also a printer, so that all the Goodman brothers had a printing company. But at this time that I'm telling you about, Joe was very active. He was about 19 years old, very active in the local YMHA, and there was an election, and he was electioneering, and he got a sore throat. And he didn't recover from it. It got worse and worse and worse, and we discovered that he was tubercular. Very young. And he had been in sanitaria all over the United States. He belonged to the Printers Union. They had a place in Tennessee. He was sent there. He was sent to Colorado. In those days, they thought the cure for tuberculosis was make him sleep outside where it's cold. If he doesn't die of the tuberculosis, he'll freeze to death, I guess. But Joe was a sick man, always. And he came up to Boston to go into the business with his other brothers, and was living home with my mother and me and Herman and Simon. Mike had his own home. And he would call my mother and he'd say, "Ma, what you got for supper?" "Here's, I got this and that." He said, "Well, I'm bringing back a friend. Is it okay?" "Bring them, I'll have enough. I'll put a little more water in the soup. There'll be enough. Bring them home." "Okay, his name is Mr. A.P. Tite." Joe would come in, and my mother fixed up the table, and she had everything all hootsy, lovely. Joe's bringing home a friend. He walks up, and he says, "Well, when do we eat?" She says, "Where's your friend?" I said, "I'm not bringing anyone home." "Who's the Mr. Tite you were bringing?" "My appetite I was bringing home." And those were very corny, but it was family fun, you know. And my mother took it all. She took it all in great stride. One time, when this was long before Joe was married, my mother went in to wake him up to go to work. This was back in Springfield, and he didn't answer. Knowing that he was a very sick man, she shook him and she shook him, and he didn't wake his eyes, open his eyes. And she came screaming out of his room, "He's dead, Joe is dead." And hysterical. So the other boys, Simon and Mike and Herman, all ran in to see what it was, and Joe was sitting up. And "What the hell did you do?" Is, "I just wanted to see if Ma loves me." Well, they gave it to him, sick or no sick. She had died of fright. She buried him 3 times, really. That time, and when he really died. And then, to our great surprise, he started to go with a girl who was sort of a kissing kin. Her mother's family and my father's family were umpty-umph cousins. They all came from the same place in Russia. They were distant cousins. Joe fell in love with this girl, and she with him. And he was a little older, and my mother saw that it was wrong. He was a sick man, and she just adored this man. And my mother went to her sister-in-law, her own sister-in-law, and says, "You go and see Alice's mother. You're friends with her, and you tell her that she must not marry my son because he has tuberculosis. She's taking her good, healthy head and putting it into a sick bed." Now, I think she was some gal. She did not say, "Why shouldn't he have a chance like everybody else to be married?" Well, despite what the mother said, I can do nothing with her. She's determined to marry this boy. And my aunts, see, they were all girls together in this little town in Russia. She says, "Well, then you are putting nails in the coffin." The man was terribly, terribly sick. And they got married, and they lived in the same town that we did, and there was nothing that could be done for him. He was so sick towards the end that every night a different brother went to sit the night through with him. And he would get these yearnings for food. And he wanted bacon and eggs. Well, she kept a kosher house. So she got around that. She had a pot and a pan and everything and kept it out in the hall. If he wanted it, she was a very devoted wife, as you will hear. It was for Joe. Nothing was too hard for Joe. The night that it was Eli's night to sit up with Joe, see, death, sickness and death was a family affair. You didn't trot them off to the hospitals or to homes or to whatever. You just took care of your problems. That night, Eli called us, and he got one of the younger boys on the phone, and he says, Joe just left. And we had a car among all the families, and we had to tell my mother, oh, tell her. Of course, there was no father. I mustn't forget that I won't make Hollywood if I cry. Anyhow, we went up to where they lived, and it was a hell. It was terrible. She broke up her home, came to live with my mother and me. We were the only two left. And she went out to Denver, where she had an uncle, just to see if everybody got tuberculosis from him. Nobody got it from him. He had his own glasses, his own dishes, but he was sick. And he was 33 when he died. Now, Alice stayed out in Denver with her uncle for about a year, and she came back. Alice is now 87 years old. She has never married, never had any children, never found anyone as wonderful as this sick man that she married. Now, if you read that in the book, you'd say, well, that's a lot of crap. Those things don't happen. But they do. And it was a very terrible thing for my mother. Terrible thing. Anyhow, that takes care of Joe. We got him out of the way. We got Simon. We have Eli. Who's left? Mike.
We had Mike.
And Herman? Did we do him? We did him. And now we're down to me, and I am the last of the Mohegans. And I'm not about to tell you about myself because it isn't worth telling. I left home. I did. I left home. Oh, I must tell you about Marilyn's father and me. When Marilyn's mother died, my mother and I, my mother did, who the heck knew about it, giving her out for adoption or anything? She's our kid. We got to take care of her. So at 2 weeks old, my mother went to the hospital and brought this prize package back. And I was 23 years old. I was the baby. I knew nothing about babies. And she shared a room with me. My brother Simon had a room right next, see. And when the baby would cry, he'd jump out of bed and he'd holler, what's the matter with the goddamn kid? She must be sick. Call a doctor. Send her to the hospital. And my mother would say, sha, she wants a bottle and she's wet. Go to bed. And that's how we took care of her in those terrible days. And we got to the point where my mother became pretty proficient at handling a kid. Had a very big straw coat, you know. Everybody was so sorry, not for the kid, not for the girl who died, not for the husband that was left, but for my mother who had to be. So I was working, and we decided, my mother would do the diapers. You hung them out on the line. There were no ready diapers, and she was tired, and she wasn't well. And someone told her about a well baby clinic. I think this will be interesting to the Maryland children when they hear it. So my mother says, what is a baby clinic? She says, you take the baby there and there's a registered nurse. She tells you what to do. This was a 100% Irish neighborhood that we lived with. There wasn't a Jew within a stone's throw. Everybody went to St. Somebody's church or something, and there was this little old Jewish lady. She wasn't so old. She was 63. By standards today, she was Maury's age. Hang on. So my mother said, okay, I'll go. So she dressed the carriage and fluffed up the lacy pillows, and she goes with this kid to the baby clinic. And all the young girls, some with bellies of little kids, they were there to get public health information. And the nurse looks at the baby in the carriage, and she says, who are you? She says, her mother died, I'm the grandmother, you know. And she examined the carriage and all. She took the baby out, and she said, this, to her women sitting around, the young girls, this is how a baby should look. This is how a baby should smell, sweet and soap. And so my mother came home, just I didn't even go to college. I know how to take care of a baby. Today it's funny, but it was a very sad thing.
Mhm.
My mother, of course, died when Marilyn was 8 weeks old. I don't know if you know this story, do you? Have Marilyn ever told it? Well, it's hard for me to tell it, and it's hard for her to hear it, too. So I became her surrogate mother. I myself had just been through a experience that I thought that Bessie was lucky to die. Just think what happened to me. I was engaged to be married, had my wedding dress bought, everything was all ready, the date set, and I decided I didn't want to marry this guy because he couldn't make up his mind. One day we'd say, we're going to live here, we're going to do this, and I insisted that we take my mother along with us, that we would get a 2-bedroom house, and the boys would pay for my mother's keep, but I couldn't leave her. This was before Marilyn was born. And he'd go home and talk to his mother and father about it, and the next night when we met, Plan A that we had already had an addenda of A1, AB, his mother said this and his father said that, and they think, and I thought, dear God, what's going on here? Not for little Edna. Well, I told my mother, and she never said a word. I knew she was crushed, because I was a real old maid. I was 22. And she knew what it was to be an old maid. She was 16 when my father was in the Russian army. He was 20. And everybody would say, he's 16, she's not married yet. What's going to happen to her? Here I was, 21 and a half, or 22 the most. And I turned down, it was terrible. She was ashamed to go out on the streets and everything. So we didn't know about these kind of, I don't know why I brought that up now. Oh, about the Marilyn taking care of a baby. But we managed Exhibit A. And I think that's about everything. There's so much. I could go back to the story of my mother and father, and go back to Russia. It was the most interesting thing. We have a family book that traces everybody way back. I can go back to my great-grandfather, not when he was born, but telling when he died. No computation, you figure how many years old he was. And it gives everybody in the family up to the last one I haven't put in. Yes, I even put in Hermine. I found a place to squeeze her in there. And
tell about the Goodman book and how it was
the
formulated.
Goodman book is what I'm talking about.
How it was formulated.
Yeah. My mother had a very dear girlfriend. They grew up together. And she had a brother. And this Aunt Sarah brought my mother home to her family. And she introduced her brother, and it was love at first sight. And they got married. I don't know where my maternal grandmother was. She was living in another part of the country. I just don't know. It's something that never came through to me. But my father had to go into the army. In those days, the army was very selective. The Cossacks came through the town and went through the Jewish community and say, one boy from every Jew house has to be a soldier. And if it was, they kidnapped the little boys, you know, little Jewish boys. Did you know this? Kidnapped little boys and farmed them out with peasants so that they would be raised as, what are the Russians? Greek Orthodox, you know, Greek Catholic Orthodox. And some of those boys were never seen again by their families. And my grandfather said, my father was not married. My parents were not married yet. He said to my brother, and to my father, when the soldiers come to take a man, you go, not your brother, because he's a married man with 3 children. You give his name, and you go serve the Kaiser. And we will see that he gets across the border and gets into what was then called Palestine. He has a family, and your life is yet to be shaped. So when they came around to their little house, who's the soldier? Who's going? This one. What's his name? And he gave his brother's name, and he gave his brother's age, and he served his time in the Russian army of 4 years under his brother's name. My grandfather was devastated about it because he had broken a commandment. He gave false witness against somebody, and it bothered him. He was a poor, dear cobbler with great principle, and so he believed that he had to do penance. Never mind 3 Hail Marys or something else. He had to do a real penance, and he decided that he went to the synagogue on Monday and Thursday and Saturday are the 3 days that the Torah is taken out and read. But Monday and Thursday were weekdays, you know, not a Sabbath, but you went then too. And he decided that when he went to shul, to the synagogue, to do his Monday prayer, that he would take off his shoes and stockings and put peas, dried peas, they're hard, put them in his stockings, stand on them, and stand through the service a couple of hours, just doing penance and punishing himself with discomfort. Do you follow what he did? He was a great man, that guy. Anyhow, my father wasn't the best of soldiers, and his grandson Joseph wasn't either. He hated the army. But they did things. Now, I just read this recently, and it was like I was reading the story of my father's life. They needed a band to play. So they said to my father, you're going to play the flugel, I don't know, some kind of a wind instrument, I don't know how. You'll play. They gave him an instrument, and they beat the hell out of the kids, the soldiers. He was a young man, 20. He said, okay, I'll play, but he didn't know how. So every night, when the other soldiers were asleep, he went down in a subterranean tunnel, and he practiced blowing notes on the horn. Because he knew if he came on the parade ground tomorrow when he wasn't playing, that he would be whipped, just horsewhipped. It's hard to believe it, but that's what happened. Anyhow, he survived, and he came home, and he and my mother were married, and you know that part of the story. But I maintain that if Joe is musical, he sure didn't get it from the Boonans. He didn't get it from the Goodmans. He got it from the Russian army. It was full cycle. Time.
A couple last words to end the tape?
Oh, I don't know. I'm wound up, and I could go on and on and on, but I don't think everything is interesting. I went to New York, the first young girl to leave the family. I was 23. Marilyn had a place to stay. Her father boarded out with her somewhere, and I figured that I had to do my bit, my own thing, and my family was shocked. What do you mean she's going to New York alone? New York! I worked for lawyers and had a very high salary, had $25 a week, of which my mother used to keep 20 and give me $5 for spending money.
All we want to say is thanks.
For what? Anyhow, I will say this. I never thought that what happened in my family, after I got grown and read, nothing that happened in my family was any different than what happened in other immigrant families, Scotch, German, Irish, Swedish, whatever. But not every family had someone who could write about it. And if you remember the comedian Sam Levinson, with his funny stories about his mother, you know, I said, what's so funny about that? That happened in my house. That happened to my brother so-and-so or my uncle so-and-so. But he had the ability to go on, stop teaching school and make a living out of it, and he was very much prized. I don't know if either of you remember him, Sam Levinson. You know, funny laugh. He'd just go to pieces when he told about his funny mother and the things she did. But I think I could go through another couple of hours, but I'm not going to. And that's that. There are a lot